So we've got a potentially massive problem now developing for the federal government and also the NFA system, because the DOJ has officially admitted what may become the central issue in this entire NFA challenge. The government is now no longer really defending the NFA based on the taxes that everyone traditionally associates with this law. Instead, the DOJ is now trying to save the entire NFA by tying this entire structure, the registration scheme, and all of that to a completely different tax. And the plaintiffs are now arguing that this exposes the real constitutional problem in this case. If the government can still force registration, fingerprints, approvals, federal databases, and felony penalties under a tax that no longer actually exists, then what exactly are the limits of federal powers? And what are going to be the limits going forward? So let's break down what is now happening in this critical NFA challenge that is trying to build off the $0 tax change. Now, before we jump into this video, if you want to support the channel, one of the best ways to do that is simply by subscribing. You can also hit the like button that just tells the algorithm that you appreciate this content, and so it shares it with more people. Now, as I mentioned in the intro, this case challenges the NFA's registration requirements for items including suppressors, silencers, short-barreled rifles, short-barreled shotguns, and also any other weapons. Historically, the NFA survived because it was treated as a tax statute. Courts said that the registration requirements helped to enforce the making and transfer taxes. But after Congress recently reduced those taxes from $200 to $0 in the One Big Beautiful bill, there have been several challenges to the NFA's current structure because of that $0 tax change. The plaintiffs recently pointed the court here to the Fifth Circuit's new decision in a new ruling and binding precedent that they issued in a case called McNutt, where the Fifth Circuit rejected the government's attempt to justify a federal alcohol distilling restriction under the taxing power when the law was not actually raising revenue. But now the DOJ has responded to that precedent, and what they're saying is actually very interesting. The DOJ's argument is basically this. They believe that that Fifth Circuit ruling in McNutt does not control this case because the NFA is different in their eyes. According to the DOJ, the challenged NFA provisions do not reduce revenue like the alcohol distilling ban in McNutt. Instead, the DOJ says that the NFA's registration system still helps the government collect and enforce a different tax, which is the special occupational tax that is paid by certain businesses dealing in NFA items. The DOJ also argues that the Fifth Circuit McNutt case does not require every regulation to directly raise revenue on its own. In the DOJ's view, a regulation can still be constitutional under the taxing power if it helps enforce a valid tax system. That is now the government's main fallback in this case. Even if the making and transfer tax is now zero, the registration system allegedly still supports the special occupational tax in the DOJ's eyes. But the plaintiffs now say that that argument makes no sense. Their response is that the NFA's registration requirements were historically justified because they helped collect the making and transfer taxes, not some separate annual occupational tax. And now that the making and transfer taxes are zero for these items, the plaintiffs argue there is no longer a real tax on those registration requirements that need to be enforced. They also point out that the government is relying heavily on an ATF declaration, but the plaintiffs argue a government employee's declaration cannot save an unconstitutional statute when the issue before the court is a pure question of law. One of the most important parts of the plaintiff's SIR reply that they just replied back to the DOJ in their claim essentially involves the DOJ's claim that the ATF denied 691 applications in 2025 because of special occupational tax issues. The government wants to use that number to show that the registration system still helps enforce tax compliance, and so it's still tied in some way to a tax. But the plaintiffs argue that number actually hurts the government and does not help them. That is because there were roughly 2.2 million NFA weapon transfers in the fiscal year of 2025 and 691 issues with the SOT tax out of nearly 2.2 million transfers equals about 0.03% of all those issues and all those filings. So the plaintiff's point is that this is not a meaningful tax enforcement system. It is a massive registration and approval regime being justified by a tiny number of alleged occupational tax issues. And even then, the plaintiffs argue that the ATF never clearly explains how many of the 691 cases were actual non-payment cases instead of ordinary paperwork problems. The plaintiffs also use the ATF's own paperwork against the government. They point out that the Form 4 says its purpose is to facilitate the collection of the required transfer tax, not the occupational tax. That matters because the government is now trying to reframe the NFA's registration system as if it was really always about enforcing the occupational tax, and that's all it was aiming to do. The plaintiffs say that that is revisionist and that is trying to change the history surrounding the NFA. The system was built around the making and transfer taxes. Those taxes are now zero, and the government cannot rewrite the statute after the fact to save it, and so they can't just change the history to say, well, we can keep enforcing all of these restrictions under the NFA, even though the tax is now $0. The plaintiffs also hammered the limiting principle issue in this case. Their argument is that if Congress can impose a small annual tax on businesses and then use that tax to justify registration, fingerprints, photographs, local law enforcement notification, and felony penalties for everyone else, well, then there is no real limit on federal power. They then even compare it to Congress putting a small annual tax on grocery stores and then trying to require anyone who possesses broccoli to register with the federal government just to make sure that they are not, actually secretly operating a grocery store. This point is very obvious in the case. If the DOJ's theory actually works and is allowed to move forward, it could justify almost unlimited federal regulation through backdoors on taxation. So this case has now moved beyond the initial question of whether the NFA still looks like a tax. The fight is now about whether the DOJ can save the NFA by tying the entire registration system to a separate occupational tax, even after the making and transfer tax has now been reduced to $0. The DOJ says yes, but the plaintiffs say no, they can't do that. And the plaintiffs argue that the government's theory would convert the taxing power into a general federal police power, which Congress has never allowed. So that's the latest update in this critical NFA challenge trying to remove the remaining restrictions on suppressors and SBRs and SBSs after the $0 tax change. The DOJ has now made its answer to the new precedent that was submitted to this case, which was the McNutt case coming out of the Fifth Circuit. The government says that the NFA still survives because registration helps to enforce the special occupational tax, but the plaintiffs have now responded that this is a revisionist theory that does not match the statute, does not match the historical justification of the NFA, and does not create any meaningful constitutional limit. And if the court agrees with the plaintiffs, this case could become one of the most important modern challenges to the constitutional foundation of the NFA, and this is all happening because of the reduction of the tax, taking it from $200 to $0. So that's the latest update in this Silencer Shop NFA case. As we get more information, as this unravels more, I will let you guys know. If you like this video and you'd like to support the channel, one of the best ways to do that is simply to like, comment, and subscribe. All of those things help to fuel the algorithm and just tells the algorithm that you appreciate this content, and so it shares it with more people. But as always, thank you so much for all of your support, and never forget this nation was built by armed scholars, and this nation will be maintained by armed scholars.